We're back in the land of Midian with Joel Richardson. Joel, tell us, how did we get the translation, the Red Sea?
Well, as we touched on in the last program, essentially in the Greco-Roman world, there was a misconception. They didn't understand. If this is interesting, if you look at the maps created the world according to Herodotus, you look at maps the world according to Strabo, they don't have two bodies of water. They don't have the Gulf of Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba. They just have one Gulf. So they didn't even, the Greco-Roman world they were not even aware that the Sinai Peninsula existed. So if you look at their maps, you just have the Arabian Peninsula, then you have Africa, Egypt. And so they were confused. So when the translators of the Septuagint, with this sort of confused Greco-Roman geographic worldview in their head, when they started translating the Septuagint, the Hebrew Old Testament, they came to this word Yam Suf. They didn't know what to do. So it's this sea of Suf. They go, what is it? They just imported this Greco-Roman name, Arathra-Thalassa, the Red Sea, which was what they referred to as this body of water that's much further south of the Arabian Peninsula. And they imposed it into the Gulf of Aqaba. And so then that made its way into the Septuagint, eventually made its way into the Latin Vulgate. And today, this false Greco-Roman geographic misconception is we still feel the impacts of it in our modern English translations. And so this is something that needs to be put to bed a long time ago.
Yeah, man, it completely destroys the biblical narrative.
Right, and it throws everybody off. And this is a big part of the reason why the whole church has been looking in the wrong place for the mountain of God, for the Mount Sinai.
Right. And a mountain that does not in any way approximate what the biblical record states. You know, there's no way that Moses could go up on that mountain and no one would know where he's gone for 40 days and 40 nights of fasting. And what's become of Moses, this man that brought us out of Egypt? Well, all you had to do is, shout up there. He's right up there at the traditional Mount Sinai. He can't get lost up there.
Right. It's probably a lot smaller than what we'd be looking for. And it's much smaller than what Josephus and Philo and some of these Jewish commentators and historians from that period, they describe it as an exceedingly rugged and tall mountain that was really difficult to climb. And that really doesn't align with the traditional site, at all. We have solid evidence. Look, we started out, we were talking in the last segment about Midian. The Septuagint, this is really interesting. The Septuagint, when you look at the way the translators relate to the town or the city or the land of Midian, whenever they come to that word Midian in Hebrew, they translate it, interestingly, a subtle variation as Madiam. Why Madiam? Well, because in this period, there was a well-known town known as Madiam. So I've got a map here. When you go to the writings of Claudius Ptolemy, he has a work called The Geography, and he documents, coordinates of thousands of cities and spots and all over the ancient world. And here's a map that someone has recreated based on the works of Claudius Ptolemy. He lived shortly just after Paul. But as you can see here, he has two cities really right next to each other. One is called Madiama. The other one is called Modiana. Okay, he got confused because of the variation between Midian and Madiam. But he places these two cities right next to each other. Where are they? They're over there in northwest Saudi Arabia. So the point is that translators of the Septuagint, when they saw Midian, they go, oh, this must be Madiam. Everybody knows where Madiam is. It correlates today to the town of Al-Bad, again, which is 12 miles from Jebel al-Lawz. All right, it all falls into place. Second, the translators of the Septuagint, when they came to the term for the elders of Midian, they used this specific phrase, which in the Greek always means the city councilors. The city councilors. When Jethro goes to visit Moses at the mountain of God, it says Jethro went out. So it uses the language of him leaving the city. They always use references that make us understand that they thought Midian was a city. Why? Because there was a well-known city in their day known as Madiam. So we begin with that. We begin with that, is that in Paul's day, this was well known among the Jews. Now again, the translators of the Septuagint, they were over there in Alexandria. So after the Septuagint, then you have Philo. Philo was a Hellenized Jewish philosopher and commentator. So he gave commentary on the Old Testament, and he made a very specific reference, and this is critical in this whole discussion. You'll never see Gordon Franz, you'll never see David Rohl discuss these traditions, because these are devastating to their claim that this is all about these 1980s, biblical adventurers. No, these are ancient Jewish traditions. Philo specifically said that Mount Sinai is the tallest mountain outside of Midian, right outside of Midian. That's a pretty specific description.
And it is literally, as you say, 12 miles outside.
Yeah. And we looked at the last segment. We said when you're in El-Bad, you step out of the caves of Jethro and you're looking right at those mountains. You're looking, there they are.
Yeah.
It dominates the horizon. So then Josephus comes along. Josephus, again, he wrote shortly after Paul, 1st century. Now, he's a Jerusalemite. He doesn't live over there in Alexandria. So now, because scholars will say, well, maybe there was a Jerusalem tradition, maybe there was an Alexandrian tradition, maybe, they didn't always meet. But the point is, now we have a second testimony from someone who lived in Jerusalem. And Josephus writes quite a lot about Mount Sinai. He writes a lot about the Red Sea, the mountains around the sea crossing. Everything lines up with the Gulf of Aqaba.
Right.
But he also, he validates Philo's statement, and he says that Mount Sinai is the tallest mountain in that district, in that area of Midian, again, just outside of the town of El-Bad. So if we trust at all the testimony of Philo and Josephus in the Septuagint, we only have one option. The tallest mountain in that whole area, the tallest mountains, it's Horeb and Sinai. It's Jabal al-Lawz, Jabal al-Makla, as they're commonly called. These are our only options. So either there was a very false tradition among the Jews during the 1st century, or they still knew, even after the exile, after the Babylonian exile, they still knew where it was. And we have enough historical hints to look at it and say, absolutely, the most reasonable guess, the most reasonable option of all of our candidates is in fact Jabal al-Lawz. And again, for clarity, the Bible only gives us one option. It has to be east of the Red Sea. So everything comes together. It's all pointing in the same spot. It's all pointing to the same mountain.
And what's the evidence of Paul? He's referring to this in the book of Galatians. We have him going down to Arabia.
Yeah, and this is huge. I want to really dig into this. I'm even thinking in the next segment, the next show, we're going to do this bonus show.
Yeah, we've got to, because there's no way that we can cover it all in this. So
yeah. I really want to mine this, but I'll say this. There's only 2 references in the New Testament to Arabia. They're both in Galatians. And there is very strong evidence that Paul himself, after he met Yeshua on the road to Damascus, knocked him on his duff, turned his theological world upside down, there's very strong evidence that he went to Mount Sinai. That Paul, like Elijah, he went to Mount Sinai, and that is where the Lord revealed the fullness of Paul's gospel, that he would go preach all over the world, that is where he received it by revelation. And all evidence points to the fact that Paul, as a thoroughly biblically literate Jew, a devout Jew, his identity would have been formed by the fact that he was a Jew, that he would have agreed with this Jewish tradition that was espoused by Josephus, that was espoused by Philo, that was understood and recognized by the translators of the Septuagint. We have no reason to suspect that he would have believed anything else. So we know where Paul would have believed it was.
The prized student of Gamaliel, having memorized the Torah, as he said, he was more zealous for the Torah than any of his peers. This is the man that was chosen by Yeshua to take the gospel of the kingdom to the Gentiles, because he understood the gospel of the kingdom. Because, he had the schoolmaster down, and now he can relate it to the Gentiles. And, we of course have stripped Paul from his Jewish context completely in the Christian world. Right. We try to remake him. We try to twist his words. This is what's done consciously, and so there's something that we can't twist, and that's what he says about Mount Sinai.
Right, and this is what the traditionalists do: is they'll quote again Herodotus and Strabo, and and so forth. And they'll say, well, Paul clearly would have, his understanding of geography would have been entirely determined by the writings of the Greco-Roman geographers. And I go, no, his worldview would have been determined by the Bible. His worldview would have been determined by the Jewish traditions of his day. And then lastly, they would have been determined by Greco-Roman designations. And even that requires some unpacking. So I've got a map up here. I want to show you something here because I thought this was interesting. And as Americans, we always need maps. You know, we always get confused. But so here's a satellite image. So here you've got the Sinai Peninsula. I've put a triangle down there. That's the traditional site that the traditionalists say is Mount Sinai. Over here to the right is, in the east, is Midian. That's Jebel al-Lawz. Now, we know that Moses was shepherding Jethro's flocks in the land of Midian. Now, the scriptures say that he went to the far side of the desert and he came to the mountain of God. Now, I was reading David Roll's book, his book Exodus, and in the back he says, well, Moses actually shepherded the flocks all the way from the land of Midian, and he went all the way over there to the traditional site of Mount Sinai. And when I did the measurements, this is roughly a 450 to 500 mile round trip. Okay, you've got about 100 miles from Midian, which by the way was an oasis town with a lot of water. You've got about 100 miles before you get to the tip of the Gulf of Aqaba, Eilat. That's 100 miles of desert. Then you've got to work your way down here through the mountains. This is a 500-mile round trip. Roll fudges the numbers, and he removes 150 miles round trip. And so he pulls off, he says, well, it would have been, his total is about 200 some odd miles. And he says, well, that would have been no big deal. That would have been no big deal for Moses because, he says you shepherd your sheep where there's herbage and so forth. You go where you need to go. If you understand the topography of the area, there's no reason why he would have gone 500 miles to the southern Sinai to get food for his sheep because he lived right there in an oasis. 10 miles, 20 miles away is the town of Magda. That's an incredible oasis right toward the Red Sea. He could have gone south to some other oasis. There is no reason for him to have gone 500 miles. And then later Jethro leaves the land of Midian and he takes Moses' wife Zipporah and his children and he goes and he visits Moses. If we believe the traditional site of Mount Sinai, then we're to believe that Jethro, in his old age, would just make a 500-mile round trip through 100-mile scorching deserts, through the land of all these foreign kingdoms of the Edomites and the Amalekites. No problem. 500 miles, no, that does not make sense. So the traditional story doesn't make sense. If we stick with Jebel al-Lawz, then the story completely, everything falls into place and it makes complete sense.
David Roll and I debated this, the Great Exodus debate, and I recognize that David Roll really was a great asset in the Patterns of Evidence movie and his deciphering of the Egyptian hieroglyphs and all, and he solved the major problem, but he hadn't seen the evidence of the real Mount Sinai, and that's why I flew him down to meet with Jim and Penny because I felt like he deserved to have the best evidence put before him, and so we spent a couple days with Jim and Penny, as you just did a short while ago, and seeing the evidence, then things shifted for him. So his book came out before then. I respect David what he's done, but a lot of people want to try to, and this is what he did in the debate. He tried to tear apart Ron Wyatt, and this debate wasn't about Ron Wyatt. It's about the evidence, about the trail of the Exodus, and where the traditionalists have built their monuments, and it's basically the Roman Catholic Church built their monuments to say this is Mara and this was Elim and all. They're all in the wrong order. It makes no sense at all. But they had to find these things and build a monument there so that they've got a place to to go to their Mecca of Mount Sinai in Arabia, in the Sinai Peninsula. But it doesn't, none of the evidence lines up. And then again, after Jim and Penny were able to get these artifacts and photographs and all, as you have done, you're just bringing more and more to the table to tell us this great story, this biblical story. And it's like, okay, we can put to bed our religion, our denominations. We can put it to bed. Let's go back to the biblical record.
Right. Look, tradition, I love the movie Fiddler on the Roof, tradition. In its pure form, it's intended to pass on truth from one generation to the next, and it can serve as a good thing. It's important. Some traditions are good. But when you start out with a false traditions tend to compound. And, I've written a book on this, and I have a whole chapter where I appeal to the scholarly community, because much of the discussion over this Jebel al-Lawz, it's been very personal. It's been attacking people. And I say, guys, first of all, this is below the quality of what scholarship should be about. And secondly, the people who are searching for truth deserve better. And third, the mountain's too important. The mountain's too important to let personal conflicts get in the way.
Yeah.
This is a treasure for the world. And we need to, its mere potential demands that we treat it with more dignity than the way that it's been handled, I'd say, the past 20, 30 years.
Yeah. So, take us, continue on with our trip into Midian.
Okay, well, so actually I'll give you a little bit of a prelude, because, I think what we said is in the next show we're going to get into...
Oh, that's right. We've only got a few minutes. Time is flying by, and we've got a lot to cover next period.
Yeah, so in the next show I think we're going to discuss, okay, the traditional site. If this is not the real Mount Sinai, then how did it become the real or how did it be called the real Mount Sinai? And so I've drilled down, I've worked through all of the historical documents, and I think when we compare the evidence for Jebel al-Lawz with the evidence of the traditional site, we'll see that, in terms of what, on the scales, what the traditional site, it's the emperor wears no clothes. There's nothing.
So this is going to be the real Exodus debate. I mean, we're going to deal with the facts on the ground and the faux Mount Sinai, how it became that, and compare it with the real evidence that we have.
Yeah, for all intents and purposes, and I don't mean to be derogatory, but it's a tourist attraction. That's all it really is. Now, it's a great place of history. It has a great history in the Christian church in terms of preserving historical documents. We need to acknowledge that. And it's got an interesting history. But in terms of its legitimacy as the real Mount Sinai, it's nothing more than a tourist attraction. And as you said, there's plenty of those in the land of Israel. There's plenty of legitimate sites, but there's plenty of places that have been created as tourist attractions, and the traditional site is nothing more than that. And so, what's interesting about this, again, it's, the thing to say the traditional site is a tourist attraction. As we'll see, there are ancient traditions with regard to the traditional site, but they are well over 600 years in more modern times compared to the Septuagint, okay? So eventually these traditions develop, but it's much, much later. But here's what's interesting is even though there was, I'll say, this traditionalist or this Roman Empire was sort of putting their stamp of approval over here on the traditional side, at the same time, a lot of the early Christian writers, they didn't agree with that. This is important because, as we touched on, we had this ancient Jewish tradition that placed Mount Sinai over there in Midian, modern-day northwest Saudi Arabia. And then we have, beyond Paul, of course, in the post-apostolic period, we have Bishop Demetrius, and we read about what he believed in the writings of Eusebius. But Bishop Demetrius, he placed Mount Sinai over there in the land of Midian, northwest Saudi Arabia. Origen, not my favorite theologian by any means, but he's a very important witness. He placed Mount Sinai over there in Midian, northwest Saudi Arabia, as did Eusebius.
Well, we're going to have to continue on with this because we're going to dig deeper into this, ladies and gentlemen. This is all the time that we have on the air. But again, we're going to come back and we're going to explore this in detail for those of you who want to get into the meat of this. And we're going to get into the real Exodus debate as we continue on with this.